Good afternoon and welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Tom Stever. And joining us from the University of Missouri is Scott Brown, livestock economist up there. Welcome, Scott.
Good afternoon, Tom.
Scott, we talked a week ago and the weather had finally broke. It had gone from being very cold to just a little bit less cold. But now this week has been dry. What does that do?
Yeah, so I think when you start to look at some of the drought monitor maps that we see across the country, we're seeing more signs of dryness this time of year. I always remind folks not to put too much stock into, these drought monitor maps this time of year because we're usually not growing a lot of grass or growing a lot of crops. But I do think it's important from a subsoil moisture standpoint. If we continue to stay dry about the time we start to warm up and want some green grass, we might see a little delay in that. So, again, I don't want to put too much emphasis on that today, but we certainly want to be paying attention to what kind of moisture comes from this point forward.
Yeah. We talked about the markets last week, and we're going to talk about them again. Hogs were a little bit stronger this week, just a little.
Yeah, that's right. So, if you look at the hog market to begin with, up about 75 cents this week on cash hog prices. Maybe a little bit up on the strength of what we saw on the pork cutout side. The wholesale pork cutout value was up $1.37 this week. We saw both hams and bellies continue to be higher. Bellies up about $5 this week. If you look at that lean hog futures contract, it was fairly steady this week as well, so not a lot of change there. If we shift gears and look at cattle markets, I would say number one, on the feeder cattle side, we saw some positive news this week, steady to 6 higher on feeder cattle prices. We saw some heavier weight cattle that were 1 to 5 lower, but for the most part, we were higher this week. On the fed cattle side, it's been a slow week in terms of getting us to move fed cattle. I think many were waiting for the cattle on feed report we got here this afternoon. I'd say prior to that report, we were showing just a little bit of strength in terms of fed cattle prices. We'll see maybe what happens after this report came out. On the futures side, we saw both the current live cattle futures about $1 higher this week, while current feeder cattle futures were up $1.50. On the meat side of the cattle side, choice beef cutout value, just a little bit of strength, up slightly from where we were a week ago at this time.
And the cattle on feed report came out with placements and numbers of cattle as well, both stronger, both higher than what people had thought. It's a bearish report, Scott.
Yeah, I think when you look at cattle on feed, we continue to talk about really heavy placements, especially, relative to pre-report estimates. The report showed cattle placed in December up 0.8% relative to a year ago. The midpoint of the pre-report estimates would have suggested actually a contraction of 3.1%. So we fell nearly outside the range of pre-report placements. So still heavy placements coming. We I think had hoped that we moved some calves earlier back in the December report we got, but this report continues to show pretty heavy placements. When you look at cattle on feed January 1, we were 8.3% higher than a year ago at this time. That was, again, above pre-report estimate that came in 7.7% higher. So we continue to see more cattle in these in the cattle on feed report. I like to continue to remind us that USDA does survey 1,000 plus head feed yards in that cattle on feed report, and I wonder just how many smaller feed yards in some part of corn country are feeding a few cattle, and whether that even exacerbates the supply of market-ready cattle as we get in the latter part of 2018 even more.
Bottom line, do you expect this to put some pressure on the cattle futures?
So it's been such a balancing act. This additional placement data that we got, I think the market has continued to shrug that off here for a while, Tom, basically saying demand's been growing more faster than the supply side. But we have to continue to understand that the supply side is continuing to gear up, and at some point, if demand doesn't continue to grow, we could find ourselves in a much more difficult situation as we go through 2018.
Maybe this will compound it too, Scott, but we're seeing heavier cattle.
That's right. Tom, we got livestock slaughter out this week as well. Came out on Thursday, and I think one of the things that caught my attention out of that report is when you look at weights, December cattle weights came in at 837 pounds. That was 1 pound higher than where we were a year ago. That's the first month since April of 2016 that we've been above a year ago level. It's been one of my concerns that as we had cheap corn and cheap feed generally, we'd start to see weights go up. When you already got more cattle being slaughtered and all of a sudden you add more weight to them, it just pushes overall beef supplies that much higher. We'll have to continue to watch whether we ever outpace what's been a pretty strong demand picture with additional weights, even on the hog side. So hog weights in December were up 3 pounds relative to where we were a year ago. They came in at 214 pounds. You have to go back to really January of 2015 to find that kind of growth from year ago levels in terms of hog weights. So both sides of the equation are adding, and you have to go back to February of 15 to find another time where both cattle and hog weights surpassed a year ago level. So that side of the equation as well has been adding tonnage for us this out of this report.
We had a cold storage report as well that came out this past week.
Yeah, so it's the one for me that kind of continues to measure what's happening on the demand side. If we start growing cold storage stocks, I begin to worry about then what's happening on the demand side. I guess if we kind of look at the big numbers out of that report that we got on Wednesday of this week, number one, I'll start with chicken. So chicken stocks 10.2% above a year ago. That's 3 consecutive months of double-digit increases. Just continues to tell me that we're weighing on chicken prices and maybe some spillover as a result of just some pretty large stocks of chicken. On the pork side, total pork stocks at the end of December were 3.2% above a year ago. That's the first time since January of 16 that stocks have been above a year ago levels. Now we're growing overall production, so maybe we should expect a few more stocks of pork for sure. But we're going to have to watch where that goes. If we look at pork belly stocks in particular, so we've now seen them grow for 5 consecutive months, including what we got in December. They're not burdensome by any stretch, but it does tell us we're building those belly stocks. And if you remember back in 2017, some of that strength in pork markets certainly came from bellies. Meanwhile, good news, I think, on the beef side, beef stocks actually came in 13.8% lower than a year ago. So positive news in terms of what's been happening on the beef side.
And I guess in a week from now, we're going to be talking about the cattle inventory reports.
Yeah, so Tom, big report next week in terms of what happens to U.S. cattle inventory, U.S. beef cow inventory. I think many of us have been out there trying to prognosticate about where we head in terms of beef cow inventory. I certainly expect we're going to be up in terms of beef cow inventory out of the report next week, but really sets the stage for me what happens over the next 18, 24 months in terms of beef supplies. Everything that I see, even the cattle on feed report that we got today that suggested the percentage of heifers in that cattle inventory was continuing to rise, still not enough to really stop the growth in what I expect will be higher beef cow inventory when we get to talk next Friday.
Yeah, next Friday, I'll be speaking to you from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association meeting out in Phoenix. So we'll see what they have to say about this, too. I'm sure there'll be a lot to report from that meeting out there, too. Scott, it's good to be with you again.
Great to be with you as well, Tom.
Thank you very much. Scott Brown from the University of Missouri, livestock market economist. Thank you for joining us for our weekly livestock market update. I'm anchor reporter Tom Stever on Brownfield.